Alright, in this video we're going to continue our Unit 2 review with our last few questions. Now these last few questions on the review are actually topics from Unit 1, all about properties of our intro to functions. So we're going to have topics like inverses and piecewise functions to look at. So for question 10, we're being asked to find the inverses of the following equations. Remember, the most important thing about finding an inverse is to take your input and your output and to switch their positions. That's going to be what gives you your inverse. So I'm going to take my input x and write it on the outside of my function, and I'm going to take the name of my function f of x and write it on the inside where x used to be. So 2 times f of x squared, squared minus 4. So now they have swapped. And now that I've swapped them, this is my inverse. So I can go ahead and use my inverse notation to say that this is my inverse function. Now it's not quite done yet though, because to have our function in the proper notation, our output should be on the outside, and right now it's on the middle. So I'm going to have to unwrap this to get it in the proper form. The easiest way to unwrap it is to figure out what's happening to it and do those steps in the opposite order. So I'm going to go ahead and make a list. If you don't have to make a list, that's fine, but it can help us organize our thoughts. The first thing happening to the inverse of f of x is that it's being squared. The next thing happening, according to the operation, is that we're multiplying by 2. And the last thing happening is that minus 4. So I need to undo these steps in the opposite order. So to undo the third step, minus 4, I'm going to add 4. To undo times 2, I'm going to divide by 2. And to undo squared, I'm going to use its opposite, the square root. So I'm going to go ahead and do these 3 steps in this order in order to get my f inverse alone. So I'll start by adding 4 to both sides. Plus 4, plus 4. Now I have x plus 4 on the left, and 2 times the inverse of f of x squared, and my plus 4 and minus 4 have canceled. Up next, we're going to divide both sides by 2. So we'll get x plus 4 over 2, and these 2's will cancel, further unwrapping my inverse term, f inverse of x squared. The last thing I have to do is square root both sides to get f inverse completely alone. So my f inverse of x is going to equal the square root of x plus 4 over 2. And that's all finished. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for example B. So for example B, we have our input t and output h of t that can switch places. So t equals the negative 3 times h of t minus 1 over 2. So we've switched their positions. That officially makes this the inverse function. Now I just have to write it in the proper format by solving for h inverse of t. So here's the term I need to solve for. Let's figure out what's happening to it. The first thing happening to it in this numerator is that times 3, and up next is the minus 1 from the numerator, because there's invisible parentheses there holding those together. Now I'm also dividing this term by 2, and I have this negative out front. Now the way that I make something negative is by multiplying or dividing by a negative number. So I'm going to go ahead and group these together and say that we must be dividing by negative 2. If you want to make it 2 separate steps, for example, divide by negative 2, then multiply by an invisible negative 1, that's totally fine. I'm going to group them together into one step so I can undo them all at the same time. So here are the things happening to h inverse of t. My job is going to be to undo these in the opposite order. So to undo divide by negative 2, I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 2. To undo minus 1, I will add 1. And to undo times 3, I will divide by 3. So let's go ahead and take a look here. We will multiply both sides by negative 2 to start. Let me use a different color. Times negative 2 on both sides. So negative 2t will be on the left, and on the right, the negative and the negative will cancel, and the 2 and the 2 will cancel, leaving me with just 3 times the inverse of h of t minus 1. There. Now we can get rid of the minus 1 with a plus 1 on both sides. So negative 2t plus 1 is 3 times the inverse of h of t. And my last step is to divide both sides by 3 to get rid of that. There we go. Now my h inverse is alone, and it equals negative 2t plus 1 divided by 3. All set. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at question 11. Question 11 is asking us to graph this piecewise function. Remember, a piecewise function is a function that has been cut into pieces and stitched together. This is our Franken function. So we're going to take both of these equations and graph them, but we only want certain parts. So let's start with the top equation, negative 1/2 x plus 3. This is in slope-intercept form. The intercept is that positive 3, so I'll go ahead and get that on my graph here. And the slope is negative 1/2. That means I have to go down 1 and over 2. And we always go over to the right. So down 1 and to the right 2. So here are some dots that show us where my graph is going to be once I start drawing the line. Now, the thing about this function is I don't want the entire line. I need to chop it. And it tells me right here that I'm going to be chopping it at the x value 2. I only care about the x values of this graph where x is less than the number 2. So x is 2 right here. So I'm going to chop my function and only take the x values smaller than 2. X is smaller than 2 this way. So I'm going to chop my function at 2 and only take the left side. Now I have to take a look at what's happening at 2 to determine what this endpoint looks like. And it says less than, it doesn't say it's including the number 2. So I'm not going to include the 2 on my graph. And I can show that by putting an open circle where I touch the number 2. Now we can graph my second part of this function, my second piece, which is the equation f of x equals negative 1. Remember, f of x just means y, so this is y equals negative 1. So y equals negative 1 right here, but this equation tells me that I don't care what my x values are, my y value is always going to be negative 1. So if I'm all the way over here on my graph, y is going to be negative 1. If I'm all the way over here on the right, y is going to be negative 1. And if I start connecting all these negative ones, I can see that this graph is going to be a horizontal line. Now again, I don't want the entire line. This inequality here tells me I only care about the x values greater than 2. So again, we're going to chop this at 2, but this time I only want the x values bigger than 2, which are the ones to the right. So I'm going to chop my equation at 2 and only draw the graph to the right. So that's going to be the horizontal line to the right of 2. Now, my inequality does tell me that I have an equal sign here. So at 2, I do care about that value. So I'm going to use a solid circle in order to represent that I do care about that number. Now, I can go ahead and erase my extra dots if I want to, just to show that these are not part of what I actually graphed. My directions, whatever I want to do, that's fine. This would be what my final function looks like. It's just the green function, the left portion of 2, and the blue function, the right portion, including the value 2. My last question is going to ask me to evaluate a piecewise function, and I don't have a graph this time. I'm just going to use the equation in order to figure out what my answers are. So my first one says, here's h of x. I want to plug in the number negative 5. And I can see that my h of x function is split into 3 pieces. Each piece cares about its own x values. It's picked x values for its team, and it doesn't care about any other x values except the ones that are on its team. So my job is to figure out which team this x value belongs to, so I can figure out which piece of my function to plug it into. So this x value is the number negative 5. I'm going to look at these inequalities to see which function cares about the number negative 5. My top function only cares about x values less than negative 5, not including the number negative 5 itself. So negative 5 does not belong to the first function. My bottom function only cares about x values bigger than 0, and negative 5 is not bigger than 0, so my bottom function doesn't care about this number either. The function in the middle, however, includes the number negative 5. It says it will take every x value between negative 5 and 0, including both. So I can plug negative 5 into the middle function. 4x squared minus 1. And the x value I'm plugging in is that number negative 5, whose team we had to find. This is the team it belongs to. This is the only function that cares about what happens to the number negative 5. So we can plug negative 5 in here and see what we get. We'll follow the order of operations. Negative 5 squared is 25, which we'll multiply by 4 and then subtract 1. That's 100 minus 1, which makes our answer 99. For the second piece, we're plugging in the number -7. I have to figure out where -7 lives in these teams right here. So -7 is less than -5, which means the top function cares about the number -7. It doesn't belong to any other team. It's not between 0 and -5, and it's definitely not bigger than 0. So the only equation that cares about the number -7 is the top one. So if I wanted to solve this equation, I would plug my -7 into the top equation. 3 times x minus 2. And I can plug in the number -7. Let's go ahead and solve this. 3 times -7 is -21 minus 2. I get -23. There's my answer to that portion. Now the last question over here is asking which function cares about the number 8. 8 is not less than -5. It is not between 0 and -5. 8 is greater than 0, which means this function is the only one that cares about the number 8. So we have to do 2 plus the cube root of the number we're plugging in, which is the number 8. Now a cube root is asking a number times itself 3 times equals 8. So the square root would be a number times itself twice. The cube root is a number times itself 3 times, and your calculator or Google or your brain can tell you that the number times itself 3 times that give us 8 is the number 2. 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. So that's the number 2. So 2 plus the cube root of 8, 2 plus 2, our final answer is the number 4. And we're all done evaluating. All right, good luck studying for your test. See you on Monday.